Good morning. This is Talking with a Good Man. I'm Jay Goodman. I'm here in Waikiki in the morning. It's so quiet and beautiful and sort of a far cry from how busy it gets during the day. Welcome to the Screwtape Letter Lenten series as we're about to dive into letter 5 with C.S. Lewis and his book, The Screwtape Letters. My next guest has become a dear friend of mine over the last 5 years I've lived on Hawaii. He is a master catechist and a fellow knight and was with me all last year when he helped me host a year-long monthly conference on Zoom for an island-wide Into the Breach study. It was amazing and a sweet, sweet time with my fellow brothers and knights. We got to know each other. It was fun. So let's read letter 5. All right, this is Screwtape Letters, letter number 5. My dear Wormwood, it's a little bit surprising to expect a detailed report on your work and to receive instead such a vague rhapsody as your last letter. You say you're delirious with joy because the European humans have started another of their wars. I see very well what has happened to you. You are not delirious, you're only drunk. Reading between the lines in your very unbalanced account of the patient's sleepless night, I can reconstruct your state of mind fairly accurately. For the first time in your career, you have tasted that wine which is the reward of all our labors, the anguish and bewilderment of a human soul, and it has gone to your head. I can hardly blame you. I do not expect old heads on young shoulders. Did the patient respond to some of your terror pictures of the future? Did you work in some good self-pitying glances at the happy past? Some fine thrills in the pit of his stomach, were there? You played your violin prettily, didn't you? Well, it's all very natural. But do remember, Wormwood, that duty comes before pleasure. If any present self-indulgence on your part leads to the ultimate loss of the prey, you will be left eternally thirsting for that draught of which you are now so much enjoying your first sip. If, on the other hand, by steady and cool-headed application here and now, you can finally secure his soul, he will then be yours forever. A brimful, living chalice of despair and horror and astonishment, which you can raise to your lips as often as you please. So do not allow any temporary excitement to distract you from the real business of undermining faith and preventing the formation of virtues. Give me without fail in your next letter a full account of the patient's reactions to the war, so that we can consider whether you're likely to do more good by making him an extreme patriot or an ardent pacifist. There are all sorts of possibilities. In the meantime, I must warn you not to hope too much from a war. Of course, a war is entertaining. The immediate fear and suffering of the humans is a legitimate and pleasing refreshment for our myriads of toiling workers. But what permanent good does it do us unless we make use of it for bringing souls to our Father below? When I see the temporal suffering of humans who finally escape us, I feel as if I had been allowed to taste the first course of a rich banquet and then denied the rest. It is worse than not to have tasted it at all. The enemy, true to his barbarous methods of warfare, allows us to see the short misery of his favorites, only to tantalize and torment us, to mock the incessant hunger which, during this present phase of the great conflict, his blockade is admittedly imposing. Let us therefore think rather how to use than how to enjoy this European war, for it has certain tendencies inherent in it which are, in themselves, by no means in our favor. We may hope for a good deal of cruelty and unchastity. But if we are not careful, we shall see thousands turning in this tribulation to the enemy, while tens of thousands who do not go so far as that will nevertheless have their attention diverted from themselves to values and causes which they believe to be higher than the self. I know that the enemy disapproves many of these causes, but that is where he is so unfair. He often makes prizes of humans who have given their lives for causes he thinks bad on the monstrously sophistical ground that the humans thought them good and were following the best they knew. Consider, too, what undesirable deaths occur in wartime. Men are killed in places where they knew they might be killed and to which they go, if they are at all of the enemy's party prepared. How much better for us if all humans died in costly nursing homes amid doctors who lie, nurses who lie, friends who lie, as we have trained them, promising life to the dying, encouraging the belief that sickness excuses every indulgence, and even if our workers know their job, withholding all suggestion of a priest, lest it should betray to the sick man his true condition. And how disastrous for us is the continual remembrance of death which war enforces. One of our best weapons, contented worldliness, is rendered useless. In wartime, not even a human can believe that he is going to live forever. I know that Scabtree and others have seen in wars a great opportunity for attacks on faith, but I think that view was exaggerated. The enemy's human partisans have all been plainly told by him that suffering is an essential part of what he calls redemption, so that a faith which is destroyed by a war or a pestilence cannot really have been worth the trouble of destroying. I'm speaking now of diffused suffering over a long period such as the war will produce. Of course, at the precise moment of terror, bereavement, or physical pain, you may catch your man when his reason is temporarily suspended. But even then, if he applies to enemy headquarters, I have found that the post is nearly always defended. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. And that was letter 5 in the Screwtape Letters. Hey, Dallas.
Hey, what's up, man?
Not much. Dallas, thank you for joining us, joining me with this and doing this for me. I really appreciate it. Pehea oi.
Mai kai, mahalo. Oi, pehe oi. Mai kai.
Micah. Yeah, so if you would just maybe do a short intro for yourself. We had a
Sure.
little surprise for everybody, and then we'll get started just on your take on Screwtape Letter 5 and just kind of how we can apply it to Lent, to ourselves and our, as we go through Lent and weed out all those bad things and the bad habits and the vices and grow in virtue during Lent and beyond, of course.
Yeah, for sure. Well, mahalo no ke ia la kuikava o vau o Dallas Carter. No ho vau ma Milalani, makamoku puni o Oahu. O vau he po'o, mai ke kahikula i wailua o yo ho'i St. Michael. Nui ko uhau oli e kama ilio me oko I ke ia la e pili ana ke ia puke o yo ho'i Screwtape Letters. My name is Dallas Carter. I'm from the island of Oahu, same island as Jason. And I am the director of a high school out in Waialua. It's St. Michael High School out in Waialua on the North Shore of Oahu. And I'm very happy to be here today to discuss my insights or, my whatever insight I might be able to provide for the Screwtape Letters. And specifically, I believe it's Screwtape Letter number 5. So I'm very honored to be asked by Jason to be here and to talk story about it.
Mahalo, Dallas. I appreciate it. It's awesome. Thank you for that beautiful intro.
No, and thank you for inviting me to reflect on this. It's been quite a long time since I've read through the Screwtape Letters, and my schedule is such that even leading up to this, I tried to reread it. It's not very long, but I reread most of it, but specifically letter number 5, just to kind of refresh my mind about the message that Uncle Screwtape had for his nephew.
One of the major themes of chapter 5 is despair and hope, and how Screwtape wants Worma to just create despair in the guy's life. I don't know if you caught that, or if you could maybe expound on that, with your background and stuff and your knowledge.
Yeah, in letter number 5, we're introduced to the reality of the onset of World War II. And it's interesting because, a lot of what C.S. Lewis wrote, World War II was the backdrop for a lot of what he wrote. I mean, think about Mere Christianity. It started out as radio interviews during the war, and eventually those radio interviews to get people's mind off the war and whatnot, that became eventually Mere Christianity. He put it all together and wrote a book on basically his radio interviews. And then even the famous Chronicles of Narnia, you remember in the beginning, if you remember Language in the Wardrobe, the Pevensey children, they're actually sent to the countryside because London's being bombed, or it's being shelled. And so they're sent there. And so World War II really is the backdrop of a lot of what Lewis writes. And so number 5, addressing the war, it's very interesting because, it really is happening. There really is a war at that time when this is, being written. And what I think in letter number 5, what I find interesting is that and I'm not sure what the specific study guide is speaking about. I haven't read that study guide, but I think it's interesting that Screwtape actually points to the despair and the destruction of war and tells Wormwood, hey, listen, this is all good. This is all good. This is coming from from Screwtape's point of view, from their angle. Like, this is all good. Like, despair is fun. Seeing destruction and seeing humans tear at each other, this is great and all, but let's not lose focus on what really matters. We need to get the patient to hell, as he refers in letter 1, I think, to our Father, the house of our Father below, right? That's what he says. And so it's interesting because he actually kind of wants to he actually is almost reserved about war when you read it. He's a little reserved about war because he's like, listen, all of this despair and destruction and stuff, this is all great. But remember that there is war isn't what we want people to focus on. Back to letter number 1 is, contented worldliness, right? We want them to focus on real life, everyday stuff. The problem with war, from Screwtape's perspective, is that war, though the destruction is fun to them, is it brings out virtues as well, right? It brings out courage. It brings out helping one another. It brings out these different virtues that lead them to, as Screwtape would call them, the enemy, right? It leads them to God. And it's interesting because he wants the soul in hell so bad that he's in, hey, listen, all of this war is great and fun, but let's not forget the ultimate goal of getting the patient, to hell with us. And then what he says, he reminds Wormwood to, let's bring it back to focusing on that worldliness, right? Regular life, focus on the world, focus on that which is right in front, have your patient focus on what is right in front of them, because war brings you out. It's a memento mori, right? War reminds you of your mortality. And then all of a sudden you don't focus on the everyday worldliness. You focus on something beyond, right? Like when you think of, let's say 9/11, when 9/11 happened, people around the world, not just in the US, but people around the world for quite a long time were snapped out of their everyday contentedness and focused on things that were beyond them, because it was a memento mori, a reminder of their mortality. And I think that that's what keeps Screwtape a little reserved, when discussing with Wormwood about this war, because he wants the patient to focus on that contempt-y worldliness. Ultimately, he wants the patient to focus on finding happiness in the world, right? And not finding happiness from, something beyond that. And I think the lesson we can gain from that is when you consider what Screwtape is telling Wormwood, and an insight to that spite and envy that demons have for humans, it can tell us that instead of focusing on worldliness, we need to look toward heaven. We need to have our eyes toward heaven. And I think that that's something that is very, very real to us right now, coming out of these last two to 3 years of this pandemic that people have gone through. No matter what your opinion is of it, we've gone through something over the last 2 to 3 years. Yeah. And the reality is every time I've gone to a Bible study or some sort of religious gathering, we weren't talking about God. What were we talking about? The mandates, right? Talking about what our opinions are about COVID, and about how this is bad and that is bad, and this is a conspiracy and that is a conspiracy. I'm not here to talk about that. What I'm here to mention, though, is that in all of that, I realized that for 2 to 3 years, so much of our conversation had nothing to do with God. Yeah. It was all about other things. And I think that letter number 5 can remind us that focusing on those worldly things, focusing only on the mortal things, not focusing on that which is beyond us, is exactly what Screwtape and his pals want us to do.
Yeah. Do you think that, so we're not in a war, but we've got the whole thing with Russia and Ukraine. And do you kind of think that people have gotten so set in worldliness that if that war came to us, they would probably be angry that it's bothering us, not us, but bothering people that are, because I try not to be in the world. I really be in the world, but not of the world, like
Mhm.
I know you do and I do, and the Catholics I know that are, closest to me, that they try to do. But people that are totally worldly would probably be angry that it came to this country if it did, because it's kind of bothering them, and getting in the way of their life.
Right, right, and interestingly enough, war is horrible. War is
Yeah.
horrible. We don't want the death of innocent life, and I pray for peace, and I pray for the safety of all of
Yeah.
those who are completely innocent in any war, especially that
Yeah.
which going on right now. But I think that it would be interesting. I think at first it would be an annoyance, but then when it became real, interesting, right? Because when it became real, and then all of a sudden you are directly in danger of being a victim of war. I don't think that worldliness would matter to us anymore. We would focus on things that are beyond us. And it's just so sad that it might take something tragic like that to happen to get us to focus on what's after this world, right? That it would take something so drastic for us to consider, revisiting our relationship with our creator. And I hope it doesn't come to that. And I hope war doesn't come to our doorstep. And at the same time, my prayer is that people would come to realize the importance of remembering their mortality and remembering the necessity of having God in their lives without having a war, right?
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
that that's the goal, and that's the goal of the evangelist, right? And is to bring God to the forefront of people's hearts and minds, and not wait until something tragic happens to bring God into the forefront of their hearts and minds.
Yeah. Which goes back to what you said in the beginning about how the demons don't like war for too much, like,
Right.
because it does that trough of sadness and horror of it can help us grow in virtue, and they know that,
That's right.
and they know that we'll want to grow closer to God because of it.
It's interesting. It's almost kind of framed to Wormwood as like a temptation. Don't be tempted too much by how great war is,
Yeah.
right? Because we don't want them to think about their death and what's beyond. That plays into the enemy's hands.
Yeah.
It's let's get them back to focusing on the worldliness. Let's
Yeah.
get them focus on the fact that, hey, it's time for lunch, and I don't have time to, and I think that's from letter number 1, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, something like
Hey,
that. And
aren't you
so,
hungry? You should go eat.
yeah, that's, what, yeah, and this work's too important for me to do hungry. So let me get back to it later. And before you know it,
Yeah.
you never get around to it, right? And so,
Yeah.
yeah, you're absolutely right that the virtue and the memento mori that war is not necessarily something. And it's just interesting how it's framed to Wormwood as a temptation for them, to revel too much in the pain and suffering. And when you think about that too, um, even the Beatitudes that our Lord gave us in the Sermon on the Mount, isn't
Yeah.
it interesting that paradoxical nature of the Beatitudes, that true happiness comes through suffering and through
Yeah.
sacrifice, right?
Yeah.
So ultimately, war is not, according to what we're reading here, is not the demon's easiest way to get us to hell because of the virtue it builds. And even in the news now, I won't get into the narratives because it's too much to get into. But
Oh yeah.
immediately there were heroes painted out, right? Immediately there are people to admire and look at, and it's those kind of virtues, that kind of courage, and those type of things that are a result of tragedies like this. And Wormwood was warned, don't let that happen too much, because then people all of a sudden, become galvanized, and they want what is good and what is right. And all of a sudden they start praying again. We can't have any of that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And then they find that grace and suffering, which leads them to the love of God. And they definitely don't want that.
That's right. Yeah.
That's very interesting. Man, that's good stuff. And
Well, it's, and I think that it all comes from the fact that this is what the entirety of the book is about, right? It
yeah.
really is truly about getting people to focus on real life and focus on the mundaneness of the everyday. And so if you use that as the context, like the the map key or legend in the corner, if you use that as the legend, with or glasses that you're looking at the rest of it through, then I think that a lot of those connections can be put together, right?
Yeah.
So some letters he's talking about what to focus on. Like, this is the everyday kind of life that we want them to focus on. This is the contented worldliness we want them to focus on. And then some letters are about, like, this might be a temptation for you, but don't focus too much on this, because this gets them out of our goal of keeping them, focused on what's right in front of them, right?
Yeah.
And I also like if I'm not mistaken, I'd have to go reread it, but I also like the little, what's the word I'm looking for? Like the little preface or the introduction that C.S. Lewis gives at the beginning.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's great where he's like, I don't even know how I got these letters, but here they are, But then I also like that he warns that, that the devil is a liar, and that's always stuck with me, because to be totally honest, when I hear reports of, I always think after reading Screwtape Letters, it's always stuck with me that sometimes when we get into, spiritual warfare, a lot of times I think it's interesting that people will cling to something an exorcist says that a demon told them, or the demon told this. So, but here's my issue is, so you're going to listen to the demon's advice?
Yeah,
like you're going to listen to the demon? And I think that that's what C.S. Lewis warns about, if I'm not mistaken. He's like, listen, the devil is a liar, right? And so we're going to read these things and we might glean some things, but even from his point of view, Screwtape's point of view, don't trust everything he says, because he's a demon. And so I think that's a good way for us to move forward with spiritual warfare too, is realize that the demons are liars, period. They'll say to get what they want. And I think it's my personal opinion. I'm no expert in it, but probably don't listen to the advice of demons. I think that's probably a good piece of advice, is don't listen to them. But anyway.
Yeah. Good rule to follow.
Yeah.
It's almost like, why is what they say far more interesting to some people than what God says and what we can plainly see in his word and the catechism and the church and all those things we see at Mass,
God's given us in scripture and through the tradition of our church very clear moral guides. We have a very clear understanding of how to, we know our parameters, and we have a very clear rubric by which we can assess the moral quality of situations and the things. Let's go with that to make our decisions, as opposed to just listening to, especially if it's coming from a demon. And I just, of course, I'm not trying to harp on that point. It's just, it comes to mind when you're reading Screwtape Letters, right?
No, that's a really good point.
Yeah, it's something that comes to mind. And of course, this is all fiction as far as, the characters that are mentioned and everything. But still, I think it's great that if you reread the introduction, I think it's great that I know, I haven't read the introduction again, but I know for a fact that he mentions that he warns against, and that's probably one of the things that always, stayed with me about this, is remembering that,
it stuck well. That's almost verbatim what it says. So good job. Yeah, remember that the devil is a liar. Not everything that Screwtape says should be assumed to be true, even from his own angle. Yeah,
that's right. So, I think going back to what we're saying, is I think under the authority of an exorcist or the authority of the church, the demons will say something, but it's coming from their angle, right? Mm-hmm. And their angle might not be the truth. Their nature is to lie, right?
Yeah.
So let's be careful of listening to them for advice. And perhaps I'm totally wrong. Maybe the exorcist will tell me that they can't lie in their throat. I don't know how that works. It just
you're right on.
Screwtape Letters, warned me against that, and then kind of always stayed with me. So.
Well, doesn't it say in the Bible that Satan came to steal, kill, and destroy? Mm-hmm. And those all those things involve lying in some way, to bring about those three things.
Yeah.
So yeah, Thank you, Dallas. That was amazing.
Not a
Um,
problem.
thank you. Yeah, thank you for your insights in this and your knowledge and wisdom that God has, blessed you with. Today is a bit sobering. According to Marlon De La Torre in his study guide to the Screwtape Letters, the theme is despair and hope. So good and bad. And it's based off of the verse in Romans 8:24-25, which says, "For in this hope we were saved. A hope that is seen is not hope. Who hopes for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience." We definitely need to wait with patience and run the race set before us and to run it well. I want Jesus to return. I really do. I want to be with him, but I continue to wait with patience because waiting with impatience is just crazy. That would just wear me out. And I'm not ready to meet my Lord yet. I have too much growing to do. Screwtape uses the war that is going on at the time. As you know, C.S. Lewis had this book, Screwtape Letters, published in 1941, which was, I think, a couple of years after Hitler gave his famous speech in 1939, and then World War II ensued. Marlon goes on to say, a more fearful characteristic from Screwtape's point of view is man's ability to take an act of suffering and equate it to Christ and the redemption of humanity through Christ's crucifixion, thus elevating the virtue of hope to a position above his. There is a sin of despair, and it becomes a sin of despair when there's nothing else left for us to have open. So today's reading involves the First Commandment, which serves as sort of a backdrop, as Marlon says, to the virtue of hope. Screwtape just tries to get wormwood to give confusion all the time to the patient while offering nothing to replace it. The way the First Commandment ties to this is we're supposed to worship the one true God, and hope is intertwined within the journey of a redemption through the Father and the Son. What I just said is talked about in the Catechism in 571 and 2084. Marlon says that the Paschal mystery reflects the great lengths Jesus took to bring us to the love of the Father. The Son of God became flesh in order to know God's love. To have despair is to throw away all hope of salvation and the forgiveness of sins. Today's challenge is to read Romans 5:2-3, 8:24-25, and 1 Corinthians 13:13, and just really reflect on what those verses are saying to the believers Paul is writing to, as well as to our hearts during Lent. I would even challenge you further to read the entire chapters and not just those verses to get the full context of what he's talking about. I think the darkest and most sobering bit in today's letter for me was when Screwtape talks about wormwood securing his soul. It really makes me a little scared to think of being in hell. Like he says in reference to securing the patient's soul in hell being, quote, a brimful, living chalice of despair and horror and astonishment, which you can raise to your lips as often as you please. Despair, horror, and astonishment for eternity. I know we know this, but just think about it. It will never, ever end, ever. It's interesting he uses the word astonishment. I get despair and horror. Despair because you spent your life not believing in God and leaving yourself open to depressive states. Sin that causes you to eventually being given over to your fleshly desires all your life, and now you have this fulfillment of all that despair and what you sowed all your life. And sometimes I feel that I was sowing, and that I had to weed out, which is why we're doing this 40-day cleanse. Horror is an easy one. Hell is a scary, scary place. I know there's people out there that said they died and went to hell and then came back. Some are making it up to make a buck. Others really did. Veronica Giuliani, Blessed Anne Catherine, St. John Bosco, the Children of Fatima, and St. Faustina, they all saw hell and it absolutely horrified them. I just can't imagine seeing someone like that. I mean, if we want to, we can probably find videos out there depicting it in amazing detail, but to actually witness it firsthand and see it, I can't think they were ever the same after that. I want to think anyone having seen that horror would stick to God closer than ever, that astonishment of what hell's really like. But conversely, if you think about it, if Jesus appeared above the altar, how would that change us? If he appeared there, I know he's there in the Eucharist. What I mean is if he appeared above the altar, in all his glory, I would think less people would walk up and say amen, with a half-tired look on their faces, just going through the motions. And I'm not judging anybody because I've done that before, and we all have, I'm sure, at some point, taken Mass for granted at times. And, shame on me, right? I would be on my face before God if he literally appeared in the church like that. So why don't we throw ourselves down on our faces at Sunday Mass? I've often wondered that. But honestly, if we could, and if we did it truly from an honest and humble place in our hearts, not looking for, attention or anything, I would say amen if someone did that. I mean, David danced before the altar. But God also calls us to be one body and to be unified. If someone came up and threw themselves on the floor, it would be disruptive. It would not bring a proper, unification to the entire church. It could, I guess. I'm not saying it would, it could. People would be staring and wondering, and maybe some would gasp, and it would just take away from the focus of the church on Jesus and the Eucharist, which is our focal point. This is just my opinion based on how I have seen things work in the Bible as I read through it last year. We want to be unified when we come together. Paul speaks of this in First Corinthians 1 when he talks of division and being one unified body. Falling on the ground before the Lord can bring disruption. The crazy thing is, he is there at every Mass. How many of us go to Mass and just go through the motions, like I said before, while the entire time the Lord of the universe is up there in the tabernacle and about halfway through Mass on the altar in the flesh through the mystery of Christ. I just want to say thank you for sticking with me during Lent and the Screwtape Letters. What a journey we're on. If you would like to keep in contact with me, my email, as always, is jgoodman.deepadventure@gmail.com. If you feel in your heart to donate to this, I would greatly appreciate it. My Venmo is at jgoodman75, at JAYGoodman75. My PayPal is teamdojo@gmail.com, teamdojoe@gmail.com. You can also find me at bearschoolofmanliness.com, the website where I'm working with Bear and his ministry. Once you get signed up, I would love to plug you into a group of men who are all working, daily to grow closer to Jesus and to each other as brothers in faith. If your time zone permits, or you want to stay up late, you're welcome to join my Brothers in Faith men's group, which meets the second and fourth Saturday of every month. We meet in person, but I can put it on Zoom too, so you can enjoy it with us. We're currently going through the Father Larry Richards Be a Man series, and after that we're going to begin going through Marlon De La Torre study guide and the Screwtape Letters, ironically and amazingly. So thank you. I'll see you tomorrow. God bless. Please pray for me and for all of us on this journey that God will continue to show us, you and I, these dark parts of our lives we need to clean up in this 40-day Screwtape spiritual cleanse. I have to say, today I told my wife, I said I feel like at times, not every time, but at times God is sort of allowing me to experience what's going on in the Screwtape Letters, and it becomes very real for me. I just want to share that with you, to please pray for me, because there's been some dark moments in this, even in the last 5 days. I can't imagine what the rest of it's going to bring. Hopefully good. So let's pray for protection as we go through our day, for you, for me, for all of us, from demonic warfare, and from the intertwinings and the fuddleness, or the demons trying to fuddle everything up in our lives. It's interesting. But he's a liar, like Dallas said, and we need to remember that even what they say from their point of view is still a lie and all twisted and wrong. So anyway, I will see you tomorrow. Aloha, ahui ho, which means until we meet again.